Okay, and now we are back. Now that we know how naturally the climate has changed in the past, how in the heck do we know all of that? So there's an area of study that revolves around this whole idea. Some scientists literally pour their entire life's work into investigating this phenomena. And I want you to first think to yourself, what are ways that previous climates are locked away into parts of our planet? Right? So think about that. Maybe pause the video for a second and give that a thought. How in tarnation could we have any idea what has happened in the past? Okay. So hopefully you've taken a pause and have had a thought. So first, the thing to look at would be this whole area of study, right? There's the region, or not the region, the name that we call this is paleoclimatology. Very similar to like how we have meteorology, which studies the weather, oceanography studies the oceans, genealogy studies genes, right? That kind of idea. So this is that whole area dedicated to this, to investigating what we call proxy data. And the main goal of this work is to understand the climate of the past in order to assess the current and potential future climate in the context of natural climate variability. The big take-home point, of course, is that we have to study the past in order to better understand the future, right? It's the same thing of why do we study history? We study history so that we can hopefully not repeat ourselves, which we're really, really good at that. So that would be the idea. And the more we understand about our climate now, the better that we can make our climate models and to improve the way that we can tell the future then. So it's kind of a really, really fun thing. But think to yourself, right? Were there humans hundreds of thousands of years ago? Maybe. But did they have all the fancy instruments that we have now? No, right? They didn't have thermometers. They weren't able to go out and be like, okay, it's 5 degrees, right? Okay, jot that one down, right? No, that's not how it works, unfortunately. So we have to overcome this lack of direct measurement so scientists then can decipher and reconstruct past climates by using what we call indirect evidence. And this indirect evidence, the term for that is called proxy data. And these proxy data come from natural recorders of climate variability. Now, I understand there's probably several more ways that scientists have started to look at previous climates, but these are kind of the 4 main ways that I'm going to talk about in length. So the first is through seafloor sediment. The next is through glacial ice cores. Next is the tree growth rings, which is really quite fascinating. And you can also do a similar sort of analysis for coral reef rings. And then fossil pollen is the last one. So I'm going to go into each of these in detail, and I have really, really lovely pictures to assist these. And I don't have them in the slides right now, and it kind of goes a little bit beyond just kind of the surface knowledge that I want us to know. But in case you were curious, kind of the things that they look at, especially in seafloor sediments, but also in glacial ice as well, is something called oxygen isotope analysis. So oxygen weighs 2 different weights. So there's like heavier oxygen and lighter oxygen, and heavier oxygen is harder to evaporate and lighter oxygen is really good to evaporate. So it really, that's kind of like the main thing that we look at there. Just kind of an extra little aside in case you were wondering exactly what goes on. So first starting with seafloor sediment. So sediment, I mean, we've talked about seafloor sediments already, right? So I'm not going to go into like super amounts of detail here, but we know that the sediment contains organisms that lived on the ocean surface and took in the climate's substance. The number and type of organisms at the surface changes with that climate, right? So we know that, things like to live in certain climates, right? Like, so some plants like to live in warm temperatures, like a palm tree, right? A palm tree loves warm, maybe even dry conditions, but also really likes moist conditions. So a palm tree would not do very well in like northern Canada, right? So some flora and fauna prefer to live in certain climates. Same thing with creatures of the oceans, right? Even like plankton and things like that. So in a sea surface that's more conducive for that particular animal, the more is going to live there, the more that's going to die there, the more that's going to sink there, right? So that's kind of the idea to think with that. And so we can take cores of all of this information, and then we can basically dissect and analyze what is inside these cores. And here are just some images showing different types of cores, right? So this one kind of has a more clay sort of look to it. They can take little knives and take samples. You can like cut the whole dang core in half and see what's going on. I personally really like this image here on the right side for several reasons. One, you can see how long the sample is. So 1 meter is right about here-ish. So these are several meters worth of information. So we can get a lot from this. There's probably many thousands of years worth of data in this particular core. But what I also like is you can see the change in color, right? You can see the like legit complete change in composition between like these brown colors going to this tan, going into like this almost like greenish gray to like this lighter blue. So I just think that that is pretty sweet. A similar sort of analysis, but with a different type of material, are glacier ice cores. So glacial ice cores can tell us something similar, but it can tell us atmospheric composition. So scientists extract cores from glacial regions like Greenland and Antarctica, and these cores can extend 2,000 meters deep, if not more, and can contain more than 20,000 years worth of data, if not more. And this will also depend site to site, right? So there's been a lot of work done of glacial ice cores from different regions, and then they can compare this stuff. That's the beauty of doing climate change research, is you're able to take in all this information and compare it to what other scientists have done and see if they match. And turns out they are friggin' matching, and that's like the big like consensus of climate change. What I like about this particular image in the top right is you can see this really dark line, right? So what do we think this dark line could be? Volcanic ash, more likely than not, which is really quite sweet. I also love the expression of on this scientist's face here, like, oh my God, look at that. That's so wild. And, you know, this is work that I would never personally be able to do. I don't like being cold, so it's like not my ideal sort of situation. But also, could you imagine like being the one responsible for making sure that the freezer door is closed before you left at the end of the day? Like, whew, you could lose so much work and data in one fell swoop if you just forgot to shut the door all the way. Yikes. And you would also have to do all your work in a freezer. Hard no, thank you. But yeah, what's really neat with this sort of analysis is we can record the air that's trapped in the bubbles. So that's where we get these values of CO2 fluctuations and methane fluctuations. And then, of course, we can compare that to temperature fluctuations, and that's where we see that really nice correlation, which we'll get to later on, if not today, then on Thursday. These samples can also include wind-blown dust, volcanic ash, which we can also see again really nicely in this particular core here, pollen, and now modern-day pollution, which is really quite fascinating. The next thing that I want to go into are tree rings. Tree rings are really freaking sweet. What's really cool about these, I think, is that the characteristics of these rings, meaning the size and the density, can indicate environmental conditions. So favorable conditions would be a wider ring. Unfavorable conditions would be a narrow ring. And this changes from tree to tree and climate to climate, right? Some trees love to grow in drought conditions. Some trees prefer to grow in tropical conditions. It really just varies here. And something that I gotta point out is I thought for the longest time that we were just chopping down trees, because this is like the quintessential, this bottom left image is like the quintessential idea of what I would think of when I think of tree rings. And that's not how they extract the information. They actually take a core, much similar to that of a sea sediment or a glacial core, but they use what's called a boring tool and just drill a little itty bitty core from the trees in particular. Actually, turns out that both of my TAs for my oceanography class here at San Francisco State, they are both working on tree ring information for various trees. One's working on ones of redwoods, the other is working on juniper trees in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and they're coming up with really, really cool information for those particular regions. So what's really neat about this type of information is we can get really long chronologies established for various regions. And again, we can compare these patterns in a particular area. So say you can do redwood trees for one, juniper trees for another, pine trees for another. And again, these trees can exist in different locations for various climate reasons. And then we can like compare things in Northern Europe or in the Eastern United States or up in Canada, right? So it's a really cool comparison game that can be done here. It's the beauty of science. And these can be extended back thousands of years, and a really similar analysis can be done with coral, but we tend to not do this analysis as heavily with coral for a couple of reasons, at least to my understanding. One, we're already really messing up coral with ocean acidification and coral bleaching. Two, we have more trees than coral, right? There's a much, much greater extent of tree right now anyway. Lord knows there's deforestation going on, but of tree extent on land is much, much, much greater than coral extent underwater. Like, for example, we don't have coral here off of the coast of California. It's too dang cold for coral to really grow, for coral that we would think of. So we have trees instead. So it's a very like localized sort of analysis that can be done. Also, coral tends to grow really, really slowly. So it'd be kind of bad for us to kind of screw up that thing. But though, again, we're taking cores and stuff like that. But still, that's kind of the main idea. And the last one that I want to cover is fossil pollen. So maybe you have allergies. Maybe you suffer from allergies like me, which I never suffered from allergies until I came to California, because now I'm exposed to completely different histogens and antigens and things like that. Like I'm exposed to completely different plants than what I grew up with. And that's the thing, right? So different plants can thrive in different regions. So because of this, and then the pollen that is then kind of locked in the rock, can then tell us what kinds of flora and fauna existed in that area at that time. So we can do radiometric dating, we can do all this stuff and analysis and figure out what kinds of plants and trees and flowers and things of that nature grew in that particular location. So what I think is really awesome about just paleoclimatology and proxy data in general is the fact that it's really interdisciplinary, right? You really rely, like if you're doing tree ring analysis, you rely on tree experts to help tell you what are conditions that are favorable for growth for that particular thing. You rely on geologists to help you analyze fossils and what is in these fossils. You rely on scientists that are willing to go to the really cold areas to get your glacial ice cores. So it's this whole scientific community working together to figure out what the heck was going on in our climate in the past. So I just think that that's one of the neatest things ever. So, and also fun factsies about the tree ring stuff, that originated in the University of Arizona, which is where I went to grad school. So there's a whole tree ring building there on campus, which is really quite sweet. So thanks again so much for watching, and stay tuned for one more.